Something is rearranging my furniture every night. Ever since I was a young boy, I would wake up in the morning with my furniture arranged differently than when I went to sleep. Sometimes it was small, like my lamp in the wrong place or my shoe rack was tipped over. Other days I'd wake up and the bed would be in the wrong spot, the dresser on the wrong wall, my deck in front of the door. In the beginning, it wasn't in a messy fashion. It seemed like a perfectly normal way to arrange my bedroom, just in a different way than I preferred. I have a very early memory from around 5 years old of my mom yelling at me for moving around all my furniture at night. I swore up and down that it wasn't me. She seemed conflicted when she was yelling at me. I wasn't a troublemaker. She knew it wasn't something I would do, but looking back now, I think she was just scared of the thought of it not being me. After a couple of hours, I convinced my mom it wasn't me. After all, I was a small kid. I don't think I could have physically moved it on my own. Next to blame was my older brother. He was 11 at the time, so it still would have been hard for him to move my stuff, but not impossible. My brother liked to mess with me. No more than any normal brother, but never any over-the-top pranks. Mostly just because he was lazy, though. No way he'd lose sleep over something so weird like moving my furniture every night. After my brother denied it, and adding on that he stayed at his friend's house for sleepovers often gave him an alibi. My mom attempted to blame my dad next, but of course, that comment was not taken lightly, and ended with my parents just pointing fingers at each other. My mom spent that night with me in bed. She tried her best to explain why she was sleeping in my bed without making it sound scary, but I could tell she was scared. I wasn't scared at all because it felt normal. I see now as an adult why she was freaked out. The night felt normal. If anything, it was a fun night, like a big sleepover. My first sleepover even. We woke up the next morning and my mom gasped and gripped the sheets. Wait, how did this happen? I was right here. My mom looked around the room. It was pretty easy to do, so given that the bed was right in the center of the room. This hadn't happened before. It was always in a normal spot against the wall. It was like the room was showing off that it could put the bed in the middle of the room without us waking up. My mother always claimed to be a notoriously light sleeper. She said how she can't fully turn her brain off in case we need her in the night, but she always seemed to sleep deeply to me. The rest of the day, she kept insisting that someone was sleep-waking or something. She didn't think anyone was playing a prank, but she knew someone in the house was doing it. She had to believe it. My parents ordered a Serenity camera online to put in my room so they could watch the footage the next morning. They got next day delivery, so I'd have to go one more night without them being able to watch me sleep. That night, they decided to let me sleep in their bed. I was even more excited than the night before. Now, this was really a sleepover. That night, my mom tucked me in tightly in between her and my dad. I remember she held me all night long. I woke up the next morning to my mom sounding terrified. My parents' bed wasn't even in the bedroom anymore. It was sitting in the living room right outside my parents' bedroom. My dad sat up and started to get as concerned as my mom. How did our bed get out here? He whispered with a stutter. It can't even fit through the door frame. Was it taken apart and put back together out here? He hopped out of bed and picked me up into his arms in the process. We all stared at it confused. Even as a young boy, I knew something was really wrong. My dad started to take the bed apart to bring it back into their bedroom and noticed that the screws were loose. Some were even missing, like it was put back together in a rush. I remember my parents being on the phone with, I think, the police, but they never showed up. I remember my mom being upset on the phone when they wouldn't help us at all. That night, My dad installed a camera into the corner of my bedroom. My mom once again slept next to me. The camera they got was basically like a baby monitor that recorded the night. My dad had the monitor beside his bed to be an extra set of eyes. The night came and went. My mom and I woke up with my room yet again rearranged. She looked up at the camera to see that it was destroyed. All video from the night was destroyed as well. This was right around the time when baby monitors could record to an iPhone, and you could watch the video the next morning, but everything about the video was corrupted. My family went to the police station that night, insisting that someone was in our house. The cops wrote down a statement, but that's all that came of it. My parents for the next couple of years kept trying to figure out what was going on, trying different solutions to find out how this was happening, only to find dead ends over and over again. My mom started to believe the house was haunted, and after a couple of years, my dad believed her. This was the main reason for our move when I was 8. I was so excited to be done with whatever was going on. At this point, the sleepovers weren't cute. I wanted my own space. My parents didn't let me go to summer camp or stay at friends' houses like my brother did. I was sick of it. It was night 1 in the new place. It was only about 30 minutes from our old house. Not too big of a change, but just enough that I was excited. My parents felt so good about the new place that they let me sleep in my own bed. I remember they told me at dinner while we ate McDonald's over a makeshift table made of cardboard boxes. I jumped up and down and hugged them both. That night, I got tucked in, and my mom was hesitant to leave me in my own bed. She seemed worried but knew I needed this. My room didn't have much in it. Just my bed, dresser, and a few boxes with my clothes in them. I remember falling asleep that night and thinking how creaky the new house was. But I didn't mind. I was hopeful. I woke up the next morning before my mom and dad. I didn't have curtains yet, so the sunrise woke me. I sat up and stretched. I rubbed my eyes to wake myself up, and I immediately felt a knot in my throat. The furniture was moved. At that moment, I made a decision. I knew if my mom saw this, I'd be stuck sleeping next to her for my whole life. My little imagination took over, and I thought about coming home from my job one day as a grown man wearing a suit, and my mom still tucking me into bed. I sprung up and quickly moved everything back to where it came from. Luckily, nothing was too heavy for me to move. Just as I got everything back into place, I heard my mom's footsteps. I jumped into bed and pretended to be sleeping. She cracked the door and let out a sigh of relief and shut the door. How I wish I could go back in time and tell my mom the truth. I spent the next month doing the same routine. My mom always woke up at 7:30 to check on me, so I'd always get up at 7 and fix everything. It was exhausting but worth it. My mom was warming up to the idea of me going to summer camp, so I was motivated. My mom got comfortable enough to send me to camp. It was only a one-night camp that year, which was fine. She needed to take baby steps. I didn't think anything would happen honestly, but when we woke up in the morning, every single bunk bed was outside. All 20 of them. 30 kids and 10 adults. All waking up feeling confused and disoriented. Some bunk beds even on their sides tipped over. Of course, the camp counselors were confused. I knew what I had to do. I gaslit all the adults into believing it was the plan of the troubled kid, Eddie. I made up a whole story about how he convinced a few other kids to do it in the night. I didn't think it was believable, but I was so convincing that everyone believed me. The camp counselors wanted to inform all the parents when they came to pick up what happened. Of course, it was a violation and needed to be explained to all the parents what happened. Luckily, I got out of it. I went to the camp with a school friend, and his mom picked us up. His mom believed me when I said I'd tell my mom myself. As the years passed by, I realized no matter where I slept, this would happen to me. I turned it into a sleepover trick. I'll tell my friends to come over, and sure enough it would happen. I'd even sleep at their houses and it would happen. Whenever I was trying to show off the trick, the room would be in even worse condition than a normal night. I felt like I had a superpower. The years went by and it just became my life. It was like brushing my teeth in the morning. Now and then I'd forget to fix everything in the morning and my mom would check on me. It only happened a few times, but each time I saw fear in her eyes. I always just said I moved stuff around the night before because I was bored of the layout. I could only use that lie so many times though. One time in high school, I was very sick. I was having a hard time getting up in the morning to move my furniture, and I didn't move my furniture for a couple of mornings. My mom was getting nervous, and I knew I had to get up before her to move it the next day. My mom came into my bedroom to say goodnight and let me know she'd be gone in the early morning, but would say hi as soon as she got home at around noon. This was music to my ears. I could sleep in and not worry about moving everything before she could barge in. The morning came and I got to sleep until about 11 o'clock. I couldn't believe how much better I was feeling. I knew I should have probably started to move my furniture and be proactive, but of course, that's not what I did. I could hear my brother in his room next door playing video games, so I went to go see what he was playing. Him being a brother, he wasn't letting me play with him, so I instead stood by his bed for way too long and annoying him. I lost track of time and heard the garage door open. My heart sank. I ran back into my room and tried to move everything back into its place. Luckily, throughout the years, I convinced my parents to get me lighter furniture. They never caught on, and it made life so much easier. Everything got replaced except for my dresser, which was a family heirloom. It wasn't all that big, but this day it felt heavy. I knew I was weak from being sick all week, but I couldn't believe how heavy it was. It was the last thing to move, but it just wouldn't budge. I frantically ran to my brother and told him I needed help moving my dresser. He leaped out of bed to run to my room. With most things, he doesn't care to help me. But I was always honest with my brother that the furniture thing never stopped. He knew that if our mom knew, our whole house would be a living hell, and she might even make us move again. He always had my back when it came to my supernatural furniture. Instead of going back into my room, I went downstairs to distract my mom. I knew she'd be mad to see me out of bed, but the consequences of my furniture being out of place would be so much worse. My socks slid across the hardwood floor, and I reached the kitchen just as she was opening the door. Her happy humming was immediately interrupted when she made eye contact with me. She set a grocery bag on the counter and got out some soup she just bought at the store. I thought she was going to yell at me, but I wasn't going to question it. I figured she was being patient with me since I was sick. Just as she got out a box of popsicles, I heard an awful sound. One that I will never forget. A sound that is completely my fault. I heard my brother scream. It was a loud scream, but short, like something interrupted it. It sounded like he stubbed his toe and then covered his mouth halfway through. My mom and I made eye contact and started to head upstairs to check on him. It was too loud to be something small. We turned the corner into my room, and I didn't know what to feel. I saw my dresser still not in its normal spot, but just slightly moved from where I left it. The dresser had a big drawer on the front that opened up like a door or a cabinet, and it was wide open and empty. But most importantly, my brother was gone. An hour went by and my brother was nowhere to be found. The doors to the house seemed to all be locked. Same with the windows. We ended up filing a missing persons report. A whole week went by and there was no sign of him. My mom thought my brother was in the middle of moving my furniture to prank me or something and got spooked and ran off. I didn't have the heart to tell her or anyone that I felt like this was my fault. I thought that maybe whatever was moving my stuff wanted just me to move it or something. After that awful week, we found something to make it so much worse. My dad was in my room with me and trying to ask more questions about our last interaction. A lot of people asked me this since I was the last person to see my brother. As I explained it to him for the 100th time, he was randomly looking at the dresser and opened up the big door we originally found wide open. It had a note taped to the inside. Before my dad took it, he looked nervously at me asking if it was mine, but he very well already knew the answer. We called my mom into the room before we read it. The following is an exact quote from the note. "I see our little game of hide and seek did not end like I imagined. Your brother is not who I intended to find me, but he will have to do for now." We had no clue what the note meant, but that didn't stop it from sending shivers down my spine. At the very least, now we knew someone had taken my brother. We thought the cops would do more to help now that we had a note. While they did do a little more to help us find him, they never found anything else. I never saw my brother again. Last year, I moved out of my parents' house. This decision was completely based on my not wanting to move my furniture around every morning. I couldn't imagine a world where I could leave my furniture as is and just sleep in without the worry of my mom seeing it. That being said, I moved out as soon as I could afford it. I moved in with my best friend, and we shared an apartment. He knew about my little party trick and was never too freaked out by it. Although part of me was scared that once he saw it was legit, he would be scared. The first morning, I woke up and the room was a mess. Everything was in the wrong place, just as usual. Although I didn't think there would even be a usual for how my room looked anymore. I was sick of fixing it. It was going to look however it wanted to look. After a couple of days of just letting my furniture do whatever, I noticed how it was being arranged was more and more chaotic. Messier. Like the furniture was mad that I wasn't putting it all back. I started straightening things, but nothing too wild. I just leave the big stuff. I mean, my roommate was weirded out, but he didn't care at first. One morning, about 2 weeks into living at the new place, I woke up with my bed on our deck outside. I knew it was going to start getting out of hand. The whole reason for me moving out was to not have to move my furniture around like crazy. I was so mad I couldn't just leave the furniture as it was. For some reason, it had to be put back to its normal spot. I let it go one more morning. I wanted to see what would happen if I left it just once more. I woke up the next day in the middle of the woods with no clue where I was. It felt like when I was a kid, and this happened with bunk beds, but this was so much worse. It was relatively easy to find my way back, but just a long walk. In all, it took me about 2 hours to get home. Not to mention having to figure out how to get my bed back home. When I got back, my roommate had a chat with me. He said how he never really thought the weird furniture thing was real and thought it was a very elaborate joke, and now that he lived with me, it was affecting his mental health. He felt paranoid and really tired and wanted me to move out. I was of course bummed, but knew it was for the best. I tried to tell him I'd start moving the furniture back every morning and it would all be okay, but that didn't seem to help him feel better. I called my parents to tell them I was coming back home. They seemed excited to have me come home. They seemed very cheerful actually. When I asked them what was making them so happy, they said they felt better than they had in years and felt so well rested. It felt nice to hear them happy for what felt like the first time since my brother went missing. I had most of my stuff packed up and was ready to move in just a couple of days. We both knew this whole moving thing might cause problems with our friendship, so we wanted to do something fun before I moved out. We did a spontaneous week-long road trip. The morning I left, I didn't move any of the furniture back. It didn't seem necessary. I noticed something strange about the road trip. At no point in the trip did my furniture move. It was the first time since I can remember I woke up with everything looking the same. I thought maybe I found some kind of weird hack. We got back from an amazing trip feeling closer than ever, feeling thankful that we did it. I walked into my room and saw everything just as I remembered leaving it the day we left for our trip. Everything except for my dresser with the front facing down right in the middle of the room. I went over to the front of it to try and lift it into place, but it felt heavy. I immediately felt the memories of the day my brother went missing flash back into my head. This thing being heavy is bad news. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I didn't like it. I called my roommate in to help me move it. At first, he was hesitant. He didn't want anything to do with my furniture. Finally, I convinced him to just help me lift it quickly. As we pushed it back up to the wall, the body of a man came falling out. He was dead and limp. Claw marks filled the inside of my dresser. It looked like it fell over while he was hiding in it. He most likely fell over at the beginning of our trip and couldn't get out. He was in the same spot where I found that ominous note a little while back. He also had a gas tank that had a sleeping aid in it that was connected to one of those things that go over your mouth and nose before surgery or something. He looked malnourished and sickly. This man was my ghost for the last 15 years, moving my furniture around, thinking it was some kind of fun game or something. This was the man who took my brother. This was the man who gave a sleeping aid to me and everyone else I lived with, so he could move my furniture around for me. This was the man who took away countless sleepovers from my childhood. This was the man who stole my mother's peace of mind my whole childhood, so I could have some sick game every morning. They never found out who he was. They couldn't find anyone that matched his fingerprints or dental records or anything at all. It's like it never even existed. Most of all, they never found my brother. They never found out how the man got in and out of my house, if he even left, or how he was always around no matter where I slept. They never figured out how he managed to sneak around my living space for so long and not be seen. That was last year, and after that day, my furniture never moved again. Story 2. I've always had a suspicion that the restaurant across from my apartment building was a money laundering front, but it turned out to be something much worse. I'm almost sure you've seen one. They're there in pretty much every major city. Those small, dingy establishments that you hardly ever see anybody going into. It could be a barber shop or a nail salon, but more often than not, they tend to be restaurants. Some place with a generic name, an unenticing exterior, almost as if they couldn't care less about attracting any customers. Because, well, they probably don't. Now, I'm not saying that every place fitting this description is being used to wash drug money or something. There's hardly a good way to know for sure. At least none that wouldn't involve putting yourself in danger trying to find out. But for the longest time, I had been absolutely convinced that was the case for the small Mexican restaurant sitting right across the street from where I lived. It's a tiny building tucked in between an equally sketchy pawn shop and a liquor store. Yeah, I don't live in the best part of town. The advertising for the place consisted of a plain white sign with the words, "Taste of Mexico," plastered across it in plain yellow font. The words were accompanied by 2 cartoon sombreros sitting at either end. During the 11 months that I've lived in this apartment complex, I can count on 2 hands the number of different people that I've seen going in there. Watching the place had become something of a pseudo-hobby for me. I don't know how to explain it, but it almost felt dangerous, as if it were something that I wasn't meant to stick my nose into. I'll go ahead and describe some of the more interesting observations that I've made over the months. First of all, I was exaggerating a bit when I said that I could count the amount of different people that have gone into the place with two hands alone. Realistically, it's been more than that. Still not a lot. Maybe like 30 to 40 different customers in total, mostly consisting of what appear to be drunk young people going in late at night. But with that said, there's only ever been a few people I've seen going in there more than once. One of them is this dude that's always wearing sunglasses and a suit. He's tall, lanky, tattoos covering his hands. I've seen him maybe about a dozen times, always between 10 and p.m. on a Thursday. And here's the weird thing about him. He's never in there for more than a few minutes, and he always comes out empty-handed. So not quite sure what's going on there. It's hard to even speculate. There's another guy who I assume to be the cook based on the fact that he always come out wearing an apron, one that's usually stained a deep red. I estimate that he's about 250 pounds, most of which is muscle. He usually comes out during night, usually to smoke a cigarette or two. And then there's the strangest one out of the bunch. A plain-looking guy who's maybe in his early 20s who's always wearing a green windbreaker and jeans. I think I've seen him going in there close to 100 times. The most frequent customer by far. Now, the freaky part about this guy is that I have never seen him leaving. It's not like I'm watching this place for hours at a time, but it still doesn't quite track. I know what you're thinking. He's probably going out the back door. And I thought that might have been the case as well. So I decided to run an experiment of sorts. One involving two video cameras. One I had lying around, the other borrowed from my sister. I left the first one recording on my windowsill, facing the street. The other was well hidden inside a bush in the parking behind the restaurant, facing the back door. I set both of them to start recording on a Friday morning, the one day out of the week that the rain jacket guy almost always shows up. I went about my day, and then I picked them up 24 hours later. To my relief, the camera in the bush was still there and still recording. Once back in my apartment, I began fast-forwarding through the footage from the windowsill camera, and sure enough, rain jacket guy goes into the restaurant at 2:45 p.m. Then I took the camera from the bush, and I began fast-forwarding through that one, pausing any time somebody would come out from the door. There were a few that did, but not one of them was the guy in the jacket. I continued scrubbing through the footage, feeling a pit forming in my stomach as I got to the PM mark. The guy in the jacket was back, entering the restaurant without ever having left it. Of course, I refrained from drawing any drastic conclusions just yet. It could have been two people who looked extremely similar, right? I exported the footage from both cameras to my laptop and then watched them back in separate windows. One playing from 2:45 p.m. and the other from p.m. At first, I thought the footage must have gotten corrupted somehow. Not only was it absolutely the same guy, his first and second entrances looked just about identical. The same walk, same path, same mannerisms down to the minute details. As if the same footage had been cut and pasted into separate parts of a movie. I rewatched it about 50 times, trying to analyze it, to find any difference at all. But there were none. And this wasn't the only fucked up thing that I saw. At around 2 a.m., the chef came out the back door. He tossed some trash bags into the dumpster and then sat on the steps, smoking a cigarette. Given how dark it was, it took some time for me to make out the details of his face. But eventually, I was able to. And it looked like he was staring right at the camera. I mean, I can't tell for sure. But that's what it fucking looked like. So after he's done smoking the cigarette, he goes over to a car parked off frame. I can hear some indistinct noises, some rustling. He walks back carrying a duffel bag, and there's something moving around inside of it. But not like a human, or even an animal. I don't know how to explain it. It was fucking weird. Right before he opens the door and goes back inside, he suddenly turns around, standing still and staying that way for nearly 3 full minutes. I couldn't see his face at all, but I could guess well enough what he was looking at. Eventually, he turned back around and closed the door shut behind him. The remainder of the footage revealed nothing of note. But what I'd already seen was more than enough to make me feel as if I should drop any further investigation. But even so, I couldn't help but continue watching the place, that morbid curiosity refusing to fade. There was one surefire way to satisfy it, by simply going inside. I could feel my sensible side starting to take over, and so I prepared myself. I texted one of my friends, told him where I was going, and that if I didn't text him back by midnight, I was probably in some deep shit, and to send the cops over there. A bit drastic, I know, but there was something telling me that it wouldn't be a bad idea. It took a bit of convincing, but he seemed to tentatively agree, and at around noon, I left my apartment and made my way down the stairs, through the lobby, out onto the strangely empty streets. Begin walking at a snail's pace towards the place, and as I cross the street, I realize this is the closest I've ever been to it. The paint looks old, chipped off in some parts. The building doesn't look too bad. Also old, but relatively well maintained. At least not bad enough to invite any government intervention. I took a few deep breaths before pushing open the door and walking inside. Upon first glance, I was almost relieved. It was similar enough to most other Mexican restaurants I'd been to, which was strangely comforting in a way. It was clean, also well maintained. It was nearly empty save for an impatient-looking man in a dress shirt sitting at one of the tables. The only other person I could see was a young woman sitting behind the bar. Once I stepped in, she walked over to me slowly. "One?" she asked. I nodded. She gestured to one of the booths and I sat down. She gave me the menu, poured me some water, and there had been nothing strange about the experience up to this point. She turned to walk away, and I could see the man in the dress shirt trying to get her attention. But she completely ignored him. The man seemed understandably taken aback, and he looked over at me as if trying to validate his frustration. I just shrugged as if to indicate to him, yeah, that was a bit strange. I continued sitting there, looking around the place when I realized that I couldn't actually smell any food. The only scent detectable was an extremely faint ammonia. A few minutes later, the woman stood up and walked over to the door beside the bar, one that I had assumed led down to the kitchen. She opened it up and disappeared inside, leaving the door about halfway open. I tilted my head to get a look inside. It wasn't the kitchen. It was a set of stairs. But given the fact that it was unlit, there wasn't much to see beyond the first few steps. The man, completely pissed off at this point, threw his hands into the air. "The fuck? I've been here for 35 minutes, he shouted. "What the fuck is this?" He stood up, stomping towards the door and opening it up all the way. I could see him shaking his head before turning to look at me. "Dude, you seeing this? What the hell is this place?" I got up and walked towards him. The two of us stared down into the darkness, and it was absolute, impossible to tell how far it extended. "Where the fuck did she go?" the man asked out loud. And then he yelled down into it. "Hello?" At this point, he's more amused than angry, evidenced by the huge grin on his face. He took out his phone, using it as a flashlight as he began walking down the steps. I called after him. "Hey man, you sure this a good idea?" He paused for a moment, seeming to consider it. "Maybe not," he said. But this is gonna get some crazy fucking views. And then he continued on down into the dark. Extremely paranoid at this point, I backed away from the stairs and began looking around the restaurant. That comforting vibe has completely faded, and I get this sense that there's somebody else close by, that I'm being watched. It's hard for me to put a finger on why I'm feeling that way until I start focusing on the hallway leading to the bathrooms. It's also extremely dark, but I can see that one of the doors is open. At first, I could see nothing beyond the glints of his bulging eyes. But as my vision adjusted, I began to make out the rest of him. It was the cook, standing perfectly still in the darkness of the bathroom, staring, smiling. I could feel myself becoming lightheaded, and I get the fuck out of there, nearly tripping on the sidewalk as I burst out the front door. I ran back towards my apartment, my heart still beating against my chest, my senses completely wired. I'm pacing around the living room, trying to reconcile what the hell had just happened when I start thinking about the man in the dress shirt. I could feel the guilt beginning to creep in, but there was absolutely no way I was going back in there to look for him. And I wasn't too keen on calling the cops just yet either. Instead, I began watching the place, hoping to eventually see the guy coming out. Eventually, I did see him. But he wasn't coming out. He was going inside. Same hair, same clothes, same build. He was the same fucking man. I turned away, and I could feel my heart racing, regret and anxiety seeping into my bones. I should have never gone inside, I thought. Now they knew what I looked like. For the next few days, I avoided that place like the plague. I used the back door to leave my building for work, changed my route home, so I wouldn't have to cross paths with it on the way back. I kept my curtains closed, ensuring that at no point I could ever see it. But about a week later, I caved, sneaking a peek at the streets. What I saw was unexpected. The restaurant sign had been stripped, and it looked as if it were in the process of being repainted, as if some other business was set to take its place. Of course, my immediate reaction was that of relief. Whatever the hell was going on in that place, I wouldn't have to deal with. My curiosity had yielded no consequences, and I could continue living my life in peace. A few days later, I was leaving for work and saw that the sign for the coffee shop attached to the ground floor of my apartment building had been stripped away and that the place appeared to be going through renovations. I didn't think too much of it until I was coming back from work and saw what it was being replaced with. Taste of Mexico. I stared at the sign for a long time, but there was no way to rationalize it. Eventually, I looked away and I could see somebody walking towards me from down the street. Somebody familiar. The man in the dress shirt. No difference in appearance at all from the last time I'd seen him. He slowed his pace as he got closer before stopping no more than 10 feet away. He looked up and directly at me, his face expressionless at first before a hint of a smile began to bleed through. And then he went inside. Story 3. I finally met the thing in the closet. Starting from the time I was born, I grew up in a small room on the third floor of my family's country estate. In most ways, the room was ordinary, painted in a pale pink color that I loved until I didn't, and tastefully furnished with a double bed, a white writing desk, and ample shelves to display my beloved collection of stuffed rabbits. The only unusual feature of the room was the closet. Featuring a door of glass and painted concrete, the closet was locked at all times. The door itself was large, perhaps a foot taller than a standard one and twice as wide. Though the glass looked fairly new, parts of the door looked old. Perhaps they weren't concrete at all, but rather carved stone. Inset into the rock were strange symbols that looked like arrows and birds, the line all straight, chiseled. When I asked what was inside, my father told me it contained dangerous electrical wiring that would kill me in an instant if I ever touched it. For the first few years of my life, I supposed I believed all of that, just as I believed in Santa Claus and angels and other nonsense. Then, one day when I was 4 or 5, trying to sleep at night, I heard something from the closet, a muffled cough. It almost sounded far away, though the closet was no more than 5 feet from my bed. At first, I dismissed it as my imagination. Then, more certainly this time, I heard it again. 2 coughs in a row, muffled as if behind a very thick wall. My heart raced. My bladder emptied. I called for my mother as loud as I could. She and my father both ran up the stairs in an instant. Their movements were quick and methodical. My mother turned on the light, and my father edged toward the window. It was only after my eyes adjusted to the light that I realized he was carrying a gun. "Not the window," I said. The closet. My parents exchanged a glance, and my mother gave an audible sigh of relief. "There's nothing in the closet," she said, stroking my hair. "Now, let's change these sheets and pajamas and get you back to bed." As time went on, I noticed other strange things about the room. Once, when my parents refused to let me visit town for the 100th time, I angrily tossed a chair at my bedroom window, sure it would smash into a million pieces. It did not. Instead, the chair bounced harmlessly off of the glass and ended up clocking me in the face, giving me a nasty cut. Later, I looked more closely at the glass and realized it was thick. So was the glass on the windows downstairs, and even the car, though we rarely traveled. In fact, it was only on rare occasions that we left the estate. Instead of school, I was treated to a series of private tutors who educated me in Latin, Greek, and mathematics. On every visit, my father searched these men thoroughly, turning out pockets and looking about their mouths with a tongue depressor and a flashlight. Once, I asked my Latin tutor about the symbols on my closet. He spent a bit of time examining them, looking perplexed. "What are they?" I asked. "Hieroglyphics, no," he said. "I'd say cuneiform, except that I only recognize about half of the symbols. The others are different than any I've seen. How familiar are you with cuneiform, though?" I asked. "Very. On the way out of the house that day, I saw the scholar talking with my father." My father kept his face stony, but glanced at me once or twice, nodding his head. The next week, a new tutor arrived. I was allowed ample television time. I knew that my situation was different than most. Indeed, I was being treated more like a Renaissance princess than a modern-day girl. "Am I sick?" I asked my father at dinner one day when I was 9, and he and my mother exchanged a look. "Are you worried the tutors are contagious?" "Of course not," said my father. "Am I a vampire then?" "A witch." "A monster of some sort?" "Not even a bit," said my mother, laughing a bit now. "Am I a princess?" I asked. "A countess?" "A lady of some sort." My parents exchanged a look. "You are not," my father finally said. "We just want to keep you safe, beneath the table." My fists curled into balls. "And am I meant to be kept as a prisoner forever?" I asked. I expected my father to roll his eyes, to dismiss my question as he always did. Instead, he simply said, "No," and returned to cutting his pork chop into tiny pieces. My parents were an unbreakable vault of secrets. My tutors refused to speak of anything but their assigned subjects. I had no playmates. And so I began to talk to whoever lived in my closet. I knew someone was there. "I wonder if you're a man or a woman." I began to speak into the dark one day. "Or perhaps you're not just one person. Perhaps there are many of you." Or perhaps you're not a person at all. Perhaps you're a pack of monsters trapped in there by a witch's curse. Perhaps you're a ghost haunting me. The closet did not respond, but I kept talking anyway. It's okay if you can't say anything. I suppose we're all bound by rules of some kind. But I know you're there. I heard you cough. I think I heard a sneeze once too. My ears are pretty good, you know. Sometimes I think I hear you breathing. I went on like that for hours, some nights, treating the thing in the closet like my personal diary. It was a good listener after all. I suppose, over time, it became my closest friend. Then one night I woke to the sound of an explosion, followed by my mother screaming from far away. Then came the rapid staccato of gunfire and an eerie silence. I looked outside to see 3 black vans parked outside and half a dozen men pointing guns at my window. Then came the thwack of bullets against the glass. At first, they had no effect. Then the first crack formed. I was about to scream when I turned to see my closet door opening. Something big came out. It might have been a person, except that it was 3 to 4 times the size of my father. Through the dark of the room, I could tell that it was dressed in some kind of skin-tight suit, all made of black scales that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. The suit seemed to cover every inch, even his face. He had no hair as far as I could tell, and above his eyebrows was a ring of protrusions that might have been horns. "Get in the closet," it said, its voice lower than any man's. His hands began to tense, and his fingers seemed to lengthen into knives. "Don't open the door for anyone but me." Just then, the window exploded, and quicker than I would have thought possible. The thing threw its body between me and the breaking glass. Without another word, it hoisted me into the closet as if I were a sack of flour, and then slammed the door behind me. The first thing I noticed from inside the closet was that the mirror was one way. I could see out perfectly, though the glass. It occurred to me that the thing had been watching me every night of my life since I was a baby. The second thing I noticed was a normal-sized man in some kind of military uniform running up the stairs, his gun already firing. A pair of bullets caught the creature in the gut, but it barely winced. Pause on sight. Holy fuck, I've never seen one this. Before the man could utter another word, the thing charged at the man, swinging its long fingers, slicing him in half at the waist. The man's walkie-talkie buzzed over his corpse. "Cowboy? You still there? What age pa's we talking? What size? Cowboy?" More bullets cut through the room. The thing descended the stairs. I heard another scream. Whatever soundproofing existed in the room seemed to also work one way. Scream after scream carried their way to my ears along with bursts of gunfire. I watched bullets cut through my mattress, sending bursts of feathers into the air. I'm not sure how long it went on like that. Perhaps 10 minutes. Perhaps an hour. I shook with fear. I cried. At least I didn't wet myself this time. Then, finally, it was over. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps coming up the stairs, and the creature appeared. It held its hand to the door, which opened automatically at its touch. "More will come," he said after a few minutes. A bit of blood was dripping from his sharp teeth. I wasn't sure if it was his or someone else's. "Come." Then it reached for me and I collapsed into its arms. The last thing I saw before I passed out were 2 black wings unfolding from its back. I woke the next day in a bedroom that was completely unfamiliar. Odd sculptures of men with elongated faces lined an entire wall of the room, staring at me with contorted grins. Before long, a woman I recognized as a distant aunt entered holding a tray of dates and tea. I looked at them suspiciously, but I was starving, and I figured if she meant to kill me, I'd be dead. "My parents, your legal guardians, will be missed," she said. Why did this happen? There are some things that you are better off not knowing. I suppose the most I can say is that we come from a very old family. Maybe the oldest family, one whose roots go back to the dawn of human history. From time to time, a question of succession arises. The rules are rather arcane, but it's not strictly father to son, mother to daughter. More important are the number of surviving cousins, brothers and sisters, that sort of thing. I was trying to take in everything she was saying, but in truth, I was nervously glancing around the room. There was no closet here, no protector. I had never felt so alone. My aunt continued, "Often there is bloodshed. Sometimes a bloodbath. For years, the families lie in wait, knowing the moment of bloodletting will eventually arrive. And then everyone moves at once until things are sorted out. It's the reason we employ certain protectors." My heart was beating fast again. "For many years, you were seventh in line. Then, for a moment, you were fifth. Then third. Then, well, something terrible happened to several families. And now, here we are, with a new queen already selected and 100 people ahead of you to be next in line after her. Lucky you, I suppose." I couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop shaking. "Where is the closet?" I asked. "Your protector has been reassigned," she explained. "You don't need him anymore. The years that followed were hard. I went to live with unfamiliar relatives who knew little of my previous life. My new room was smaller, with barely room for a small desk and a dresser. I had no closet. Suddenly, I was middle class, treated like a normal child. My new family had been told that I'd been through some sort of trauma, but struggled to understand why I shied away from windows. When I tried to speak with other children, I came off like an encyclopedia, spouting occasional phrases in dead languages and facts about the emperors of Rome. I aged, growing into a teenager, getting swept up into the world. The adjustment was difficult at first, but also thrilling. I still remember the first day I was allowed to walk on my own to school. I reached a major intersection and didn't even cross when the signal came on. I was so enthralled looking in all four directions, knowing that I could walk any way I chose, off into the seemingly infinite world. By the time I reached college, my early childhood had almost started to feel like a distant dream. I had adapted, or at least learned to put on the facade of a normal person. I hadn't had a boyfriend yet, and my friendships were awkward and surface level, but it seemed I was on track to eventually integrate into the world. One day, my sophomore year, I borrowed a friend's most revealing outfit and walked through the biting cold to a holiday party. The lightly falling snow immediately summoned goosebumps on my bare skin, but I pressed on, eager to be part of the world. At the party, I drank far too much and ended up sharing my first kiss with an older guy, a senior with a bad reputation. I looked for my friends, but couldn't find them. The boy kept offering me drinks, and before too long, he was walking me home, his hand already playing with the backstraps of my dress. We practically fell into my place, a little cottage my family had rented near campus. The boy had something upsetting by that point, and I wanted him to go, but he wasn't really listening. "You owe me," he kept saying. "You invited me here. Just a little something. Just a little." I tried to push him away, but he was twice my size. He had me on the floor, wrists pinned. "Huh," he said, suddenly noticing something in the corner of the room. "What's that?" I turned, and there it was. Just as I remembered it, the closet. It hadn't been there that morning. Now, suddenly, it was back, just as if it had been there all along. "You should go," I said. I wasn't afraid anymore. Suddenly, the boy seemed small. "I don't think so," he said, tightening his grip. "You're hurting me," I said, but I wasn't really talking to him anymore. "Only a little bit," he said, smiling. "Last chance," I said, and he let one of my arms go. but it was only to start unbuckling his belt. I heard the clank of his buckle hitting the floor, then the creak of a closet door. It was the last sound he ever heard. Story 4. The 72-hour sleep ban. I've always associated my birthday with that depressing time of year where a cozy autumn turns into an early winter decay, where colorful leaves die, leaving a withered brown shell behind. Still, people are expected to celebrate their birthdays. It's strange if one doesn't. I don't. My fiancé recently asked me why I never celebrate my birthday, and it's a hard one to explain. When you've been through something traumatic, everything sort of brings you back to that moment, one way or the other. And while I'd love to tell her about it, I don't think I can without sounding like a maniac. I thought I'd start by just telling my story anonymously, and sort of go from there. It was the year I turned 13. Since You've Been Gone was blasting on the radio every hour of the day. My friends and I were quoting How I Met Your Mother religiously. It was a good time to be a kid. Since my birthday was in the middle of the school week, my big birthday plans were postponed until the upcoming weekend. Still, I couldn't complain. Birthday cake on a Tuesday didn't sound all that bad. I got home, had a small celebration with my parents, and opened a few presents. 2 new games for my PlayStation 2 score. I finished up my homework and browsed the net for a few hours ahead of my scheduled bedtime when there was a knock at the door. We rarely had visitors, so to have someone knocking at our door at 10 p.m. was unusual, to say the least. My parents had already opened the door by the time I was halfway down the stairs. There was a man in a fancy jacket with a clipboard standing outside, along with 2 armed guards. I sort of fell into the middle of the conversation. So we need you to sign the consent form, and we'll get started, the clipboard man said. Any questions? This can't be legal, my mom said. On what kind of authority are you? Ma'am, this is an emergency. We have been authorized to bring anyone and everyone, if need be, but I promise you it'll be a less pleasant experience than what you could achieve here in the comfort of your own home. As the discussion continued, the armed men pushed into the house. They had a sort of checklist they were going through, asking questions as they poked and prodded. Someone mentioned a satellite phone, which we didn't have. I hurried back upstairs. From my window, I could see them putting wheel locks on our car. They were testing some sort of electrical equipment too, and as they did, I could see the internet connection on my computer disappear. My cell phone lost all bars, and while I didn't check, I suspected they'd done something to our landline as well. They were isolating us, putting us under some sort of lockdown. I still didn't have the slightest idea of who these people were. There were no patches, badges, ranks, or symbols. Just a bunch of serious-looking men in windbreakers, with visible gun holsters. After a few minutes, one of the men entered my room. My parents were worried sick, but were told to wait outside. The man was about 6'4" and had the look of someone who could kill me with his bare teeth if need be. Without a word, he started to go through my things. You got any walkie-talkies? He asked. Any radio science projects, something like that? Nope, I said, shaking my head. I got a PlayStation 2. That can go online, right? I never got the chance to answer before my mom added. We don't let him play online games, she said. It can't do that. As if to make sure, he pulled the power cable and dropped it in a sealed bag along with various knickknacks and keys they'd collected. They weren't taking any chances, and I wasn't playing my new games anytime soon, it seemed. As they finished up their impromptu house inspection, we were asked to gather downstairs. The fancy man with the clipboard cleared his throat, and the room fell deathly silent. Even my dad, who was usually a very assertive man, didn't have much to add to the conversation. That's how you knew it was serious. For 72 hours, this and surrounding neighborhoods are under lockdown, the man explained. There is a localized problem related to a recent geological event which has caused some unexpected issues. I'm sure you've noticed some minor oddities as of late. Like what? My dad added. Milk turning sour. House plants getting a strange color tint. Swarms of frogs cluttering the roads. My parents said nothing, but they nodded. Perhaps they'd seen something I hadn't. The man put down his clipboard as he explained, calmly. You have been exposed to something akin to a chemical. It reacts violently to the release of certain hormones which are associated with deep REM sleep. To ensure your safety, we are currently enforcing a temporary 72-hour ban on sleep. Excuse me. My dad took a step forward, but one of the armed men responded in kind. They both stopped before it had the chance to escalate. Exposure was approximately 9 hours ago, meaning you have about 63 hours left to go. That'll be approximately p.m. on Friday. There is no way we can. This is non-negotiable. This is a matter of your security, sir. We have an emergency health service site, but I can promise you that it won't be pleasant. You will be chemically induced into sleeplessness for the full duration of exposure until the event has passed. It can cause long-lasting brain damage. We were handed a folder each explaining our responsibilities and rights. An unmarked red folder with 3 papers. One explaining their right to force this upon us, another explaining that we'd already signed the consent papers, and a third one was a form explaining exactly when we could go to sleep. There was also an inventory form explaining the items we were to have returned at the end of the containment. They left a box of 50 glass vials. Some kind of 4-hour booster shots. The man explained how underage children were not to take more than one every 7 hours, and that my mother, if pregnant, shouldn't take any at all. Luckily, my mom wasn't pregnant. I'm an only child. We were also given fiber bars with some kind of hormone supplement. Unmarked and unbranded, but warm. Maybe they were made recently. The packaging was sloppy at best. The fancy man was trying his best to explain, and I could see my parents were eager to listen, but I barely understood half of it. Instead, I looked at the armed guards. They looked exhausted. Maybe they, too, weren't allowed to sleep. One of them had his mouth open and almost drooled, blinking one eye at a time. I could have sworn he nodded off for a second, which prompted him to take a walk outside. I don't know if we can do this, my mother complained. It's a lot to ask. We've only just, if at any point you can't do this, you need to call this number. It's the only number that works, the man said, pointing to the final line on the final page of the folder. If someone falls asleep and can't be awakened within a few minutes, they're in terrible danger. If that happens, try to keep them awake by any means until we can get here to pick them up, and then they'll be taken to our site in Mankato, where they'll be chemically induced to stay awake. So what exactly happens if someone doesn't make it? My mom asked. If we all just fall asleep? The man shook his head, tapping the clipboard with his pen. They will most probably die. Others might too. While they went into the kitchen to explain the details, the angry-looking guard approached me with the sealed bag, handing me back my PlayStation to power cable. He gave me a pat on the shoulder. I checked with the tech team, he said. You're good to go. And, happy birthday. I'd almost forgotten that it was my birthday. I appreciated the gesture, but I just couldn't bring myself to smile. I had too many questions bubbling in the back of my head, and I was too afraid to speak. They probably talked for another 20 minutes or so before the men left, leaving my parents and I alone in the kitchen. My mother was smoking under the kitchen fan. I'd only seen her smoke 2 times. Once when she lost her job, and another time when her father got sick. Smoking in the kitchen was a surefire way to tell something was wrong. Dad was sitting with his arms crossed, looking at the box of booster shots. "This is not a joke," my dad finally said. "This is very serious. We're all going to need to help each other to get through this." Mom said nothing, but I could see her hands trembling. She'd been crying. She was shaking so much that the ash from her cigarette didn't reach the ashtray. It just plopped down on the stove. "We can't be alone," Dad continued. "We're going to do our best to keep busy. You can play as many games as you want, but you can't fall asleep." "They gave back my power cable," I said. "Does that mean it's okay for me to use the PlayStation?" "It's okay," Mom coughed. "It's okay, honey. Play your games." For those first few hours, I didn't understand what the big deal was. No more school for the rest of the week, no bedtime, and unlimited screen time. That didn't sound too bad. I gamed late into the night. Sly 2 and Ratchet and Clank were on the menu, and I had a blast. I got some snacks, along with one of those fiber bars. They tasted like twigs and raisins, but it made my brain calm. Not tired, but it made it easier to focus. It also made it harder to shut my eyes, making my eyelids itch. All lights in the house were kept on all throughout the night. Mom and Dad kept playing music on the downstairs stereo, and they desperately tried to keep me engaged. I was engaged enough just playing games, so I think it was more for their benefit rather than mine. At a.m., Dad took his first booster shot. I could hear it all the way from upstairs. He was cussing pretty hard. Apparently, those things tasted like a mix of stale rice and death. Mom took her first boost about half an hour later, but she mixed it with orange juice. Apparently that helped. By a.m., even I was feeling it. I'd never been up all night playing games like that on a school day before. Sure, I'd pulled all-nighters with my friends, but it was usually something we prepared for. So by early morning, I could feel myself nodding off. My parents were checking in on me every now and then and decided to act. We were having family breakfast, pretending as if we'd already slept. "You're always cranky in the morning," Mom said. "Try to imagine. This is just that." Another cranky morning, I knew for a fact that they'd slipped one of the boosters into my cereal. I saw 3 empty vials on the counter, and I knew none of them had taken a second one yet. Still, I had little choice but to try. We weren't even halfway through the containment yet. As we finished our breakfast, we could hear commotion outside. I was upstairs brushing my teeth, watching through the hallway window. It was our neighbors. Larry Peterson, the 55-year-old man who worked the fishing supplies at the local mini-mall, crawled out his front door. He was throwing up something black and blue onto the pavement. I'd never seen this man do anything more physically straining than trying to start a lawnmower, and now he was crawling on all fours like his life depended on it. I could hear his wife calling out from inside. She was screaming at him, but I couldn't hear what. Larry got up and almost leapt into the back of his pickup truck in a show of athleticism I'd never seen from him before. It wasn't until his wife got out of the house that I could hear what she was saying. "Larry," she cried. "Larry, wake up." I saw Larry Peterson grab a wrench, get out of the truck, and grab his wife by the hair. Suddenly, a hand covered my eyes as my father dragged me away from the window. I could hear a scream turn into a gargle, followed by a hearty laugh one I'd heard 1,000 times before. The same kind of laugh Larry Peterson would chuckle up whenever my dad tried to pull off a bad pun. My mind painted me a picture of what had happened, and it wasn't pretty. My dad spun me around and stared into my eyes. I could tell he wasn't himself. There were lines across his face that I hadn't seen before. "Stay with me and Mom," he said. "Don't look outside. People are getting sick. Are we getting sick, Dad?" I asked, a yawn escaping me. He shook me a little, as if to make sure I was paying attention. "We'll be fine," he said. "It's just a matter of time. But I don't want you to see people getting hurt. Larry isn't feeling well." There was a knock on the front door. Dad took point as Mom hid in the bedroom. I remember standing on the top of the stairs, looking over the railing to the floor below. There was a violent, angry pounding on the door. Larry Peterson's soft chuckle, coming from the other side. He didn't say anything. He just pounded on the door with his wrench, laughing as he tried to get in. He went around the house, rattling our windows. He didn't get far before we could hear a car roll up. There was a popping sound, but not like a gunshot. I think they tased him. By the time I could hear Larry Peterson get dragged off, my mom had come upstairs with a smile taped to her face, asking me to show her how far I'd gotten in my fancy new video games. She was clearly trying to keep me distracted, but I didn't mind. At that point, I wanted desperately to be distracted. I could imagine Larry Peterson on the other side of the front door, his white T-shirt stained with that strange black and blue goo he'd thrown up, wielding that wrench with a manic grip. The thing was as large as my arm and solid metal. I'd never considered it a weapon, but thinking about it made my blood run cold. Had he really killed Mrs. Peterson? Why? Mom and I spent the next few hours playing video games. We also made a plan. We went through our old DVDs and decided on a watching schedule. She'd originally planned a walk, but now we weren't to leave the house. She didn't want to say why, but I had the feeling that there was something outside the Petersons' house that she didn't want me to see. Bloodstains, maybe. I was too afraid to find out. My parents tried their best to keep the mood up, but I could tell it was getting to them. My dad was mostly just standing there, leaning against the door, staring straight ahead like in a trance. Mom tried to occupy herself by playing games and watching DVDs with me, but she was counting the minutes until she could get her next booster shot. I wasn't eager to take one. They made my stomach all queasy. We made it all the way until noon. Dad was having trouble staying up and kept washing his head with cold water. He tried to keep busy doing housework that he'd kept for a rainy day, but there were constant distractions. We could hear sirens in the distance, and at one point there was someone spraying our front door and windows with a high-pressure water hose, possibly to wash away the last traces of Larry Peterson. There were dog patrols going up and down the street, along with the occasional phone call. The one number that still worked, where someone called to make sure we were all awake and accounted for. By dinner time, Mom was having stomach troubles. Her shaking had gotten worse, and she was having trouble with sudden change of smells. Dad kept rubbing his eyes and checking his watch, getting up every 10 minutes or so just to move around. We had decided that we were going to play board games after dinner, but Mom was having trouble keeping herself from throwing up. We ended up just reheating a lasagna from a few days back. I didn't mind. Mom made amazing lasagna, but my appetite was quickly lost when I saw my mother barely keeping it together. She kept drooling and making this weird chugging sound. She was blinking slower and slower. Dad tried to get her to eat one of the fiber bars, but she just ran out of the kitchen, locking herself in the bathroom. It was touch and go for a while. I could feel my heart racing as Dad tried to convince her to unlock the door, but she just couldn't do it. After a while, she stopped responding. Dad had to break the handle with a hammer, but it was too late. She was already sleeping. I could hear it through the door. As the door burst open, Mom had only been asleep for a couple of seconds. A minute at most. But she was sitting on the toilet, her head leaning back, and something was coming out of her mouth. Black and blue fingertips, poking out over the edge of her lips. Her throat undulated. The moment Dad grabbed her, she tipped her head forward, coughing. Dad washed her face in the sink while yelling at me to wait in the other room. For a few minutes, I was just sitting there ready to run or hide. It might have been too late, I figured. She could have already been affected, like Larry Peterson. I could hear them arguing in the other room, and as their voices went from angry to desperate to sad, I didn't know what to do. When they finally returned, they sat me down to explain that we were going to be fine, that we were almost halfway through, and that we were in the home stretch. They were so kind, warm, and careful in the way they explained it, but my mind was 1,000 miles away. I had trouble focusing, and all I could think about was that strange noise I kept hearing in the background. Something outside. Dad was halfway through explaining how we weren't going to lock our bathroom doors anymore when something in me screamed at me to react. It was just a slight click, but it was clear as day. Maybe it was those booster shots, but I kept hyper-focusing on little details rather than big picture stuff, like an actual conversation taking place in front of me. I closed my eyes, and no less than a second later, there was a loud bang. Someone was shooting at us. It was only a couple of shots, but we dropped to the ground. One shot got lodged in the front door, while the other cracked the kitchen window. There were loud voices outside, laughing hysterically. They were talking, but barely making any sense. One of them sounded like she was trying to talk with food in her mouth. Mom and Dad kept quiet as 2 more shots popped off, one of them hitting the kitchen light. With an electric spark, it gave out, blacking out most of the kitchen. I could hear someone running and laughing as they continued down the street. In the distance, there was more gunfire, maybe someone responding in kind. "We can't stay here," Mom whispered. "We gotta call them. You want to go to where they put Larry?" Dad answered, "To be in a whole hospital full of these people. They're shooting at us. We can't just—" Mom quieted down and looked at me. She and Dad excused themselves to talk in private while I was asked to move upstairs. I was to stay away from windows, and I couldn't sit or lie down. They'd be up to check on me in a bit. But of course, I was too curious. While still hearing them argue downstairs, I checked an upstairs window. I could see pretty far down the street, and in the distance, I could make out a car stalling on the side of the road. The headlights were still on, but it was surrounded by at least 6 people. 2 of them were dressed like the armed guards we'd seen earlier. It took me a while to realize there was an old man sitting in that car. I'd seen him around a couple of times, but I didn't know his name. The surrounding people were trying to crack the car windows with various weapons. Tire irons, bricks, hammers, lead pipes, whatever they could get their hands on. It didn't take them long to break through. They reached in to pull the man out. It was too far off for me to hear his screams, but I could vaguely see what they were doing. They held him down and covered his face with their hands. His eyes, his mouth, his ears, leaving only his nose to breathe through. Then they just sat there. It took me a moment to realize what they were doing. They were forcing him to sleep. After a few minutes, they let go of him. The old man slowly stood up, leaned against his car, and started to dry heave. After a while, the same blue and black goo that I'd seen from Larry Peterson started pouring out of his mouth, stopping only as he coughed up some kind of clot that could barely fit in his mouth. A clot that moved. As he straightened his back, he looked at the strange group, and they walked down the street together. Some jogged. Some sprinted. One of them crawled, but it looked like he held onto something with his teeth. Either that, or something was coming out of his mouth. Something long. As they hurried down the street, I could hear more gunfire. In the distance, coming from another way, I could see another group of people. At least a dozen, but heading in another direction. Roaming gangs of sleep-deprived sick people. God knows how this thing affected them long term. When my parents were done discussing, they sat me down to explain that we were going to stay indoors and keep away from the windows. Just in case. We were locking all doors and windows, closing all curtains, and not playing anything louder than necessary. We were to draw as little attention as possible. Of course, I agreed. What choice did I have? That night, I could tell things were deteriorating. Dad almost took a double dose of booster shots as he forgot he'd taken the first one, but Mom stopped him. There were no phone calls coming in. They'd stopped checking in on us. Mom even tried calling, but the line had been disconnected. The gunfire outside was further away, but more frequent. We could hear cars honking, but no sirens. Then there were fires. At least two, somewhere downtown. We could see the smokestacks from afar. Mom wasn't doing well. She couldn't eat, and at times she could barely stay on her feet. She kept talking out loud even if no one was in the room with her, and she had to lean against things to stay upright. She couldn't keep the fiber bars down, and she walked around with her head bobbing back and forth. Dad tried his best to keep her active, but he was having trouble as well. No matter how many cold splashes he took to the face, he just couldn't stay attentive. I wasn't doing well either, but nowhere near as bad. I still had my appetite, and I took my booster shots, but I could feel the side effects. My hands kept shaking, and I had a nasty headache. There were these pinches down my neck, like someone was shocking me with a wet battery. I'd imagined things moving just outside of my vision. I kept turning around to look at the windows as I'd started to hallucinate that they were screens. By morning, there was a new problem. Both the power and the water had been cut. There was a small lake a short walk from the house, and we had no choice but to try and get some water by hand. We had some drinking water stocked in the kitchen, but we needed some for the bathroom. Mom volunteered to go, but that was out of the question. She could barely stand or make a coherent sentence. There was no discussion. Dad had to do it. We watched him from one of the upstairs windows. The sun had just risen, bathing the withering landscape in long, sharp shadows and a sickly bright glow. Mom was just staring blankly ahead, as if trying to remember what was so important. Isn't it your birthday soon? She said out loud. That was Tuesday, I responded. Did you wish for you to get older? She asked. I wish for that. I want you to be able to get older. She looked at me and laughed maniacally. She blinked one eye at a time, her left eye lingering a little longer than her right. Her eyes were sunken and dark, and she kept going cross-eyed. I think she meant well, but that look she gave me was nothing short of terrifying. It was like she'd been reduced to her most basic self. My mom was still in there somewhere, but most of it was just gone. After about an hour, I spotted Dad coming back. Mom and I were both relieved, but it didn't last long. I noticed he wasn't carrying any water. Moments later, I could see he wasn't alone. There were about 24 more people coming with him. Mom didn't seem to react. She just looked out the window and nodded to herself. For a moment, she was almost falling asleep standing up, her mouth moving up and down on its own like a bass out of water. I could see something moving in her throat. I shook her, and in a moment of clarity, she looked out the window again. As I heard something pound against the door downstairs, Mom pushed me into the closet. She ran downstairs to get the remaining booster shots and dropped it all on me along with her wristwatch and a couple of fiber bars. Someone will come get you, she said. Just wait and stay awake. I'll try to think of something. I didn't have the time to protest before she slammed the closet shut. I could hear a key slide into the lock downstairs. Dad may have forgotten something about who he was, but he hadn't forgotten how to use the house keys. I just sat there in the dark listening. I curled up into a ball, but I didn't want to get too comfortable. I could hear furniture being turned over, unfamiliar voices yelling obscenities or incoherent nonsense. A fight broke out, and I could hear someone throwing something. Another person ran up the stairs and into the bathroom, repeatedly kicking the bathtub. A woman screamed, then a man. There was a gunshot, followed by windows being broken. I could hear a muffled scream as if someone was held down. Maybe like they did with the old man outside the night before. I must have sat there for hours. In the dark, it was hard to tell if my eyes were open or not. I couldn't tell if I was really hearing something outside or if I was just imagining it. I could hear voices and whispers, but they didn't seem to make sense. Sometimes I imagined them standing just outside my door, asking me for the cheat codes for the games I'd played. All I had to keep my waning sanity company was my mom's wristwatch, and I could barely make it out. Time passed so strangely. I could be wrapped in a thought for what felt like hours, but only minutes passed. Then I'd catch myself staring straight ahead, and 2 hours could disappear. I kept repeating the next scheduled hour for the booster shot like a mantra. But things were getting stranger. The clock would go backwards. I'd imagine someone sitting across from me, a pair of white eyes staring back at me from the dark. There were little voices telling me to go to sleep, and I found myself nodding off. I could feel something moving in me, like a hand trying to fit into a glove. I finally gave up and got out of the closet. I could barely stand as I dragged the booster shots and fiber bars along in a plastic bag. I didn't care if there was anyone downstairs. I needed to see something. I needed light or some kind of stimuli. The whole house was trashed. Every piece of furniture broken. Every light smashed. There was blood spatter on the walls, and the front door was hanging on a single hinge. Every window was smashed, and our picture frames had been thrown across the room like ninja stars. But the strangest thing was an acrid smell coming from the kitchen. At first, I didn't understand what it was. It looked like a person, but there was the wrong number of limbs. After a few seconds of adjustment and trying to force myself to clarity, I realized it was a dead body. A young man with a knife sticking out of his chest, splayed out on the kitchen floor. His jaw was extended and broken on one side. There was a black and blue arm reaching out of his throat, reaching upwards to grab his own head. Something in me stirred. Something in me didn't like what I was looking at, and I wasn't sure if it was me or something else. I tried to push it down with a fiber bar, which strangely worked. I made my way outside in a daze. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to find my parents. Another part of me wanted to get out of town. I wanted to look for a bike, or just start walking, or catch a bus. Of course, there were no buses to catch, but my sleep-deprived mind couldn't separate fact from fiction anymore. That entire night was one long living nightmare. I kept imagining things coming out from the dark. I could hear voices telling me to turn around, to stop, to run. All at once, and none at all. I could barely keep my balance, and stopping even for a moment would send me straight to sleep. I had to keep going. I even took an extra booster shot, which just gave me this sharp joint pain and made me sweat. I could tell I'd done something stupid. I took a shortcut through the park. I could see faces coming out of the trees. I saw a man lying face down on the gravel path, being pulled forward by an arm coming out of his mouth. I saw a man out by the lake, repeatedly slapping his arms against the cold water surface, like a manic child trying to get as high a splash as possible. Some of it was real. Some of it wasn't. I couldn't tell which was which. Not anymore. When I finally reached downtown, I saw at least 24 people gathered outside a burning building, all of them with black and blue arms reaching out of their mouths, stretching towards the flames, as if slowly wafting air towards them. Like human kelp moving against an invisible current, they leaned back and forth in unison, praising whatever chaos they'd caused without a word or sound. And yet, I could hear them, welcoming me, beckoning me, all voices unique, carried to me by an unfelt wind. Come closer, it begged. You belong here. I turned away, and the voices grew louder, desperate, screeching, demanding my attention, my devotion. Some of them coming from outside, some of them coming from the rumble of my stomach. It's already here, it laughed. It'll never go away. It'll never sleep. It'll never stop. Hands reached for me. A face in every window. Voices reaching from beneath the concrete. Gunfire. Broken windows. Glass cracking under my rubber boots as I shuffled past burnt-out cars. It was dark, then bright, then dark again. And at some point I succumbed. I felt concrete against my cheek, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. My legs wouldn't move. My eyes wouldn't open. Yes, the voices laughed. Come. Come to us. Come burn with us. And then, darkness. I don't know how long I was out. Hours. Maybe half a day. I woke up to see a man running towards me, asking me if I was okay. A car had pulled over, bathing me in a warm light. By the side of the road, a colony of frogs looked at me. In the distance, my eyes landed on a discolored sunflower. It had turned blue. Strange how you don't notice the most obvious changes until they stare at you in the face. Turns out, exposure had happened at least 6 hours earlier than the man with the clipboard had predicted, and I'd been awake long enough for most of the effect to pass through my system. I was found unconscious by the side of the highway, about 9 miles from my house. While I did have an uncomfortable dreamless sleep, the effects it had on me were nowhere near as bad as what had happened to most of the neighborhood. I'm sure you've heard of it. Riots, they called it. Just another mess up in a low-income area. I don't even think it reached national news. Some of the people who succumbed to it early got permanent brain damage. Larry Peterson was never the same, but it was hard to tell if it was because of the emotional trauma or the sleep thing. Either way, he had to have a nurse come look after him a few times a week for the rest of his life. Mom and Dad weren't completely unharmed either. Mom developed some kind of narcolepsy after that night, spontaneously nodding off at the most inopportune times. Dad lost his sense of taste and smell. To this day, they're having a hard time explaining what exactly they experienced. To them, it was just like going to sleep and having the most horrible nightmare, only to wake up in a hospital bed. Sometimes I wonder if I did fall asleep. Some of the things I saw were so strange that there was no way to tell if they were real or not. I vividly remember the scene of hands waving back and forth outside that burning building downtown. It had to be real. That building really did burn. As you might imagine, I have a hard time looking back at this. Thinking too much about it gives me this icy feeling in the pit of my stomach, like a small part of me believes that this is all just a big nightmare. That I'm still just a clock's tick away from waking up in that closet with someone standing just outside, waiting for me. Or maybe it's something inside of me, still waiting to grab the reins. Maybe it's just a night away,